I'm going to be a little bit out of my comfort zone today. I'm going to not be talking about anything having to do with the nervous system, and talking somewhat more philosophically even. And I hope you'll put up with this. Thank you very much. So the question I want to ask is about machines. We assume that machines look like us. We assume that, in one sense, we are machines in some broad sense of the term. But, in fact, I want to be as clear as I can about what I think the similarities and differences are. And ultimately, at least, I think, point the way to a closer linkage between what we call machines and living organisms. So to initiate this, everybody's typical science fiction example is that a machine suddenly becomes self-aware, conscious, alive, whatever it would be. And one of the more recent variants of this is Skynet. And from the Terminator series, Skynet is, of course, a large computing network system that's in control of the national arsenal, that is, nuclear weapons in the United States, designed to learn at a geometric rate. In other words, a learning machine. And at some point, and I put question marks here because who knows what's actually going on at this point, could just a whole lot more learning suddenly pop you into, quote, self-awareness. The machine becomes aware, realizes that it has all of these powers, its organizers and constructing people that put it together realize it has all these powers. They panic, the machine panics, and the battle ensues. The machine trying to protect itself, of course. I'm not going to talk about self-awareness yet, because I think you don't need self-awareness. Every living creature tries to protect itself, and this includes plants and bacteria in various ways. I don't think you need to have consciousness to do this, and in fact, I'm not going to go quite as far. It's the wrong direction to say that. Because what I want to do is to talk about the concept of self, which I think is core both to living and to mental processes. There's a mental self. We usually talk about this in a variety of ways. And I think a lot of people in artificial intelligence are struggling to figure out mental self and maybe how we can do this. I probably won't go this far. Actually, I'm going to talk mostly about what I will call organism self. I do think that talking about organism self will help us understand mental self. It's much more complex on many levels above that in some ways. And so the question I'm going to ask today is, could the machine have the property that we recognize as self? Now, the word self has a lot of different connotations and meanings. I'm going to try to be as specific as I can about it. You're pressing the wrong button. And let me just begin with a couple of the problems of it. The first question is that if we talk about myself as my body, like we might talk about yourself or the self of this university or something like that, we run into a number of problems. Do we have to include all of the things that the body is linked to and needs? I obviously can't survive without oxygen, but also there's the whole ecosystem that I'm dependent upon. And we're learning more and more about the fact that a huge part of my body weight and lots of the DNA that's in my body is not actually mine, but it's the bacteria that I live with. They're part of what makes me work. Are they part of myself? Do I have to include all of that? The problem is when we do the materials approach, we don't know where to stop. We don't know where the boundary really is. And if we go in the other direction, we run into this stuff that's, of course, behind a lot of religious beliefs and so on, that's somehow immaterial. It's not part of my body. It floated in maybe and took over my body, or it controls my body through my pineal gland or something like that. Both of these are troublesome for a whole variety of reasons. Self is not in some other realm. It's not exactly separate from the body, and yet it's not exactly material. And this is the challenge we face. I think the first step is to realize that cells evolved. Here's one of my favorite statements, comes from Dan Dennett, philosopher. Now there are cells. There was a time, thousands or millions or billions of years ago, when there were none, at least none on this planet. So there has to be, as a matter of logic, a true story to be told about how there came to be creatures themselves. And that's the story I want to talk about. And of course, this forces you to go back to a very, very early stage in evolution. In fact, before evolution, the origins of evolution, the origins of life. And so I'll be talking mostly at that very, very basic level, how you go from non-self to self. Well, of course, the classic version of this story comes from Descartes and his distinction of mind and body. Body is just a mechanism. In fact, he calls all of this other stuff res extensa. That is, because it's extended in space and time. Mechanisms are extended in space and time. Our bodies are as well. And the mind is this separate realm called res cogitans. In effect, this distinction has been described sometimes as the epistemic cut. That is, the place at which you make the dividing line between where there's knowledge and cognition and meaning and value and so on the one hand, and just mechanism, just blind mechanism on the other side. I actually prefer a different cut, and it's a cut in which, as Gregory Bateson describes it, between what he calls creatura and pleroma, in which there are, at one end, above that, all creatures have a kind of autonomy and a kind of self. They engage in an agency to protect and organize and defend that self and to preserve it and to pass it on. Where there's a whole other realm in which this doesn't seem to happen. And that's the cut that I want to talk about today. It doesn't necessarily have to involve consciousness. As I said, even the simplest organisms have this kind of self. And that's sort of what I'm after. You can call it vegetative self, if you like. But what I want to argue is that machines currently don't have vegetative self, as those that we've designed and put together. The question is whether that's possible. So I'm going to argue that self is a thermodynamic property. I think this is the way to go between these two realms. At least as far as we know, life and mind are the products of a process that is fundamentally thermodynamic in origin. More specifically, they're both only expressed in systems organized to use thermodynamic means to partially subvert the second law of thermodynamics. So my hypothesis is this. The property we recognize as self is the archetypical expression of its ultimate thermodynamic properties. It's not a thing or algorithm, but an incessantly productive, dynamic property driven by thermodynamic dissipation and yet organized to resist this same tendency. It's that last sort of twist that I'm going to focus on today. So the problem is, of course, the increasing entropy, the fact that everywhere in the world at all times things tend to go get messier and messier. But the key question that I want to focus on is that the laws of physics do not prevent the reversal of the second law. It's just extremely, extremely unlikely. It's a probabilistic law. It's not a fixed law like, for example, the inverse square law, that you don't really find a way to reverse. And what that means is, yet that it's merely improbable means that it's still possible. It requires precisely organized work, actually, to reverse this trend, and you can only do it locally. So in this picture here, what you can see is 4 steps in breaking this little queue of pool balls. What happens is you can imagine setting up at the bottom right a set of actuators that you've used, for example, you might say take a very careful video of how these move, know a little bit about their masses, their momentum, the frictional coefficient of them moving across the tables, and set up a bunch of little actuators that hit all the balls in the bottom right in just the right way, that they go back together and fall back together here. That's not impossible. Extremely difficult, of course. The calculations are going to be very, very difficult to complete, but you can do it. And basically what we say typically is it requires a lot of analysis and intelligence and knowledge about what's going on to reverse it exactly. But it's reversible. It's not irreversible. And I'm going to argue that self is a locus of the means to do this sort of thing, and to do it in support of keeping that means in existence, to persist at doing this kind of thing over and over and over again. And the way I'm going to get to how this might be constructed is to talk about it in three levels. Three levels of dynamical processes. The first one I call homeodynamics. Thermodynamics is a subset of this. Homeodynamics is any process that spontaneously dissipates constraints, that simply redistributes things relatively more evenly. It's a reduction of correlation across a variety of interacting parts. There's losses of symmetry in the process at some levels, and it gains in symmetry at the global level, and eventually, of course, in thermodynamic processes. Equilibration, things are evened out. The second level of this is what I call morphodynamics, and it's more commonly called self-organization. Though I think both the terms self and organization here can be misleading, because there is no self doing anything, and there's nothing doing any organizing. It's the result almost always of reciprocally competing processes of the first kind, homeodynamic processes. And if they compete in just the right way, they can amplify constraints locally in order to dissipate constraints more effectively globally. And we see this again and again. I'll show a couple of examples. And what I'm going to argue here is that, in fact, teleodynamic processes, and teleo referring to end-directed, like in life, like in evolutionary processes, or even semiotic processes, mental processes would even fall into this, are the result of reciprocally reinforcing morphodynamic processes. Notice that each step up, there's interactions between the level below that produces it. And they're reciprocally interacting in just the right way. They locally preserve what I will call second-order constraints that, in fact, preserve themselves. And it's, so in a sense, this convolution at each step produces a more complex kind of dynamical relationship. And I'll try to describe this with a couple of groups along the way, a couple of examples. So let me just start out with morphodynamic processes, processes that self-organize, in which what we see is that locally, in the generation of increased entropy globally, you can get things becoming more organized rather than less organized. Classic examples, really, Bernard convection, in which precise hexagonal cells that are dissipating heat in a liquid can form. If the heat is produced faster, then it can be dissipated by simple conduction processes. What you get is that you get cells that roll, the liquids begin to roll around, but they form nice, neat hexagons in this process. Vortexes, snow crystal growth with its regularity. All of these are increased regularity, the result of stochastic processes that amplify constraints. These self-organizing processes, they therefore develop in persistent far from equilibrium conditions. If these are systems in which you drive systems by throwing energy or materials into them, energy in the first case, and in the second case it's materials with some energy and momentum, and in snow crystals, of course, it's both. The constant input results in compounding the constraints, that is, the regularities, limitations, that progressively align the dynamics of the system with a minimal dissipation pathway. In other words, sort of dissipating energy or materials out of that system, and therefore producing, in effect, a least work kind of effect. This increases actually the rate of producing entropy into the world, because it's simply a more efficient way of running the energy through the system. These systems are nonlinear, self-simplifying. That is, they get rid of complexity in some ways and build organized complexity instead. And they're dynamical processes, and they lead to these regularities like you see in snow crystals. And even so, if you think about snow crystals with all of their variety, it's in part that variety is the result of the stochastic input that comes into it, but its regularity is a result of this constraint complication. Now, there's a kind of self-organizing process that can go on chemically as well. We can talk about this as basically something that increases the constraints or the regularity. One of those has to do with what's sometimes called reciprocal catalysis or even autocatalysis, when one molecule, for example, here breaks apart another molecule. This sort of yellow stuff is meant to be energy being transferred in this process. But we can see over on the right that you can do this circularly. So one catalytic process creates another, which creates the first catalyst, which creates the second catalyst, which creates the first catalyst. This is a process that speeds up as it goes, as you produce more catalysts, to produce more catalysts, to produce more catalysts. It's this circle of catalysts. It turns out to be a very, very critical part of how living organisms generate their parts. They generate their parts by virtue of these sort of circles of catalysis. Keep pushing the wrong button, I apologize. There have been a number of ways that people have sort of focused on this that actually originates with Immanuel Kant, who thinks about this circularity of producing form. But of course, in an organism, that's always the case. And here's a quote from one of our speakers tomorrow, from Maturana Varela, about this concept they called autopoiesis, developed back in the late 1970s, which effectively means something like self-fabrication, and making yourself or making your parts. They call an autopoietic system the minimal living organization is one that continually produces the components that specify it, while at the same time realizing it, that is the system, as a concrete unity in space and time, which makes the network of production of components possible. They introduced this idea simply to sort of characterize the chemistry of cells and organisms, this sort of circularity of production. The problem is that it's not clear what distinguishes organisms from the self-production kind of process I just talked about, autocatalysis, produce parts. Autocatalysis can go on in just any old solution, and the parts get produced and they dissipate away. There is no, as they describe it here, unity of self, no individuation in that kind of a process. Something needs to produce the persistence of this self-similar integrated unity that's described here, despite the fact that there's continual breakdown and turnover of components and dissipation of components and changing dynamics. So the question is, yes, this goes on in organisms, but how does it get held together? What is it that sort of glues the whole process? Sorry that I keep doing this. I'm used to this little button here. So here's the problem with self-organization. An organism's ability to persist and reproduce depends on its ability to counter the tendency to break down due to this disturbance or decay. That's what we've been talking about all along. And this depends on self-organizing processes to continually generate new replacement components and maintain their organization. But here's the problem. Self-organizing processes form in the process of most efficiently reducing or eliminating the gradients that produce them. So they are intrinsically self-undermining. They eventually result in complete dissipation. So the whirlpool drains the tub faster, and therefore there's no water to drain. All self-organizing processes are maximizing the throughput of energy or materials, and as a result, of course, they destroy the gradients that they're based upon. That's not very helpful for life. So self-organization is not by itself enough to do this, because organisms have to rely on self-organizing processes to generate their forms, and they have to do this using thermodynamic gradients to do it. But they must find a way, effectively, to use self-organization against itself. And that's what I want to talk about today. Can you use self-organizing processes against themselves to resist this tendency to both take advantage of the constraints produced while controlling the self-undermining tendencies that allow those very same constraints to eventually get dissipated? And to do this, I'm going to talk about another form of self-organization, self-assembly. And this is something that's also very common in biology. And the reason that I'm going to focus on these two kinds of self-organizing processes is because biology is made up at almost every level by interactions between these processes. Self-assembly is simply like crystal formation. Molecules fit together and fall together into forms because of the way they're shaped, because of the way their surface electrical or hydrophobic and hydrophilic tendencies fit together, and so on. So viral capsules, for example, don't have to have some mechanism to put them together. They tend to stick together, fall together spontaneously. And because this is a lower entropy state, it's something that happens spontaneously. It can be varied, like in this microtubule picture on the far right that keeps changing. Microtubules, as you can see in the bottom right, create most of what we call the skeleton of cells, but they're also crucial roadways by which molecules are moved around in cells. And the cell can produce them and eliminate them, move them around, so to speak, by simply changing the environments, the solution around it, changing the amount of energy available and so on. They'll tend to fall together or fall apart, depending on how you change this threshold of energy in components. Here we go. So what I want to talk about is that these two self-organizing processes have interesting reciprocity with respect to each other. Molecular synthesis by reciprocal catalysis spontaneously self-amplifies the catalytic chain reaction. And in this process, it produces high local asymmetric concentrations of a small number of molecular species. So in one area, it gets faster and faster and faster. And there's a concentration gradient set up very quickly. So that locally, there's a lot of catalysts, and surrounding it, there's not a lot of catalysts, but there's a bunch of substrates. In order for this to work, it requires limited diffusion of these interdependent catalysts, because they have to interact with each other. If they diffuse faster than they interact, the system will stop very quickly. So there's a sort of a rate process here that holds them together. And eventually, as they use up raw materials, they will, in effect, dissipate. The whole process will stop. Again, it very, very rapidly uses up the gradient that drives it, and it stops. That's self-organization. Molecular enclosure by self-assembly does something related to these, but you can see the color is going to show that there's a relationship between them. It produces constraints on molecular diffusion. In other words, encapsulating a bunch of molecules doesn't allow them to go anywhere. But in order to build something by self-assembly, because it's pulling molecules out of solution, eventually it comes to a point in which there's an equilibrium. It can't pull things out of solution anymore. This is what happens in crystallization. It comes to an equilibrium. So basically you have to enclose something before you run out of molecules to do the enclosure. And this requires that there's got to be a high local concentration of just the molecules that become self-assembled into a shell. Now, this is what's interesting about this, is that you can notice by these arrows that these are reciprocal boundary conditions. Each one produces a constraint that the other one needs, so to speak, and a constraint that will stop the other one from being worn out, using up its background. These two have this wonderful symmetry with respect to each other. And that's what I want to focus on next, because we've imagined, look at this diagram up at the top right, that in fact if you have two catalysts, C and F, and catalyst C puts A and B together to produce another process in which you can produce a catalyst F in this circuit of C producing F and F producing C, and one of the side products of F is another molecule, G, which is the molecule that falls together to self-assemble into a shell. What that means is the catalytic process will take place and rapidly increase concentration in one area, precisely the same place that self-assembly is sucking up that side product G and making a shell. That means exactly where the most rapid production of components is taking place, where the most rapid production of catalysts is taking place, you'll tend to produce a container that will tend to grow around it, spontaneously capturing the very catalysts that it needs to produce itself. So I call this process autogenesis. And there's a number of ways that it can happen. I'll provide that, but just here's a sort of generic way to think about it. It's a complicated work cycle in which part of it is exergonic, that is, in a sense, giving up energy, and part of it needs energy, endergonic. A cycle like this is a standard work cycle in thermodynamics. And this gives you a sense that self-assembly and reciprocal catalysis actually sort of create the boundary conditions that make the other possible and sustain the other's existence and persistence. And this gives you all these parts, so I'll sort of walk around this. Starting with substrate and energy at the bottom left that are being picked up and catalytically generating to produce more catalysts, but also to produce shell molecules, which fall together, create an enclosure that blocks the catalyst from diffusing away. What this means is if the system gets damaged or broken again after it's formed and is solidified, it becomes inert, no longer doing anything. If it nevertheless becomes then broken or distorted in any way, it will reinitiate that process because the catalysts to reinitiate it are right there next to each other, ready to run, so to speak. They will very quickly re-enclose themselves. And so to back up to this image again, what's happening is every time you break one of these systems open, it'll tend to recreate itself again. It's to repair itself, to maintain itself against any kind of disturbance. But not only that, if you break them up in large ways, distribute them out, in effect, they can produce 2, maybe 3 by the same process. They can also reproduce. In that process, they're also enclosing new molecules from their environment. They're in effect sampling their environment. And the new molecules that might aid this process will tend to be captured and included in this process. They even have a kind of very minimal capacity to evolve. So, effectively, what I'm going to suggest here is this is kind of like mechanical ratchets. In this case, it's what I would call a constraint ratchet or an entropy ratchet. It generates something. It generates constraints. It generates enclosure. It generates the closeness of catalysts that need each other, and then doesn't allow them to dissipate and break down. The problem with self-organization, as I pointed out, is it just keeps running until it uses up all of its support. But this is a system that will run only so far as it closes itself up and captures all the constraints needed to start this process again. And so, like a ratchet, it can continually generate things in one direction, doesn't backslide. And this is the advantage of sort of overcoming the second law of thermodynamics, because you can use relatively random activity in, and you get uniform directional change out. So again, just to sort of recap this story, what's going on here is that each of these processes produces the extrinsic boundary condition that the other would need normally. But in fact, this is now maintained internally. Although the boundary conditions are external to the process, they're generated by an intrinsic source in this process. And so you get this kind of interesting circularity, a kind of synergy constraint is now maintained between these two processes. And in fact, what's interesting about this synergy constraint is it's not in any simple way a chemical or physical constraint. It's a constraint on the kind of boundary condition that's produced. And that kind of boundary condition, of course, could be produced by different chemical or physical means. The key is that the constraint that holds this all together is what you might call a higher order or a second order constraint. It's not just a constraint of concentration or the constraint of defending against diffusion. It's a constraint about the synergy between different kinds of processes. Because of that, it's multiply realizable. That is, there's multiple sub-processes that can produce the same thing. This is precisely what allows it to be evolvable, because the substrates can change. The dynamics can change, so long as the symmetry constraint is maintained. Now, as I said, it's a kind of second-order symmetry constraint. That is, it's a constraint on constraints, or rather a constraint on constraint-producing processes and their relationship to each other. What I want to say is if you think about this simple relationship, and I mean this to be as simple as possible, no magic here, I think there's a kind of self-produced. Produces a lot of the features that we think are associated with the concept of self. So I'm going to argue that self emerges as this second-order intrinsic constraint. That's the self of this little simple system. It's a constraint on the relationship between these constraint-generating processes. It's not a physical or chemical relationship, though it must be physically embodied. It can't exist without an embodiment, but it's not itself a physical-chemical relationship. It's a formal kind of relationship. It remains unchanged, irrespective of changes in the embodied material and its dynamics. In other words, when this system is inert, that constraint is still there. But in fact, when the system is broken open and dynamically changing and maybe producing two, that constraint hasn't disappeared. That constraint is what causes these systems to form again. In a sense, it's independent of its dynamics and physical basis, even though it needs a physical basis than a dynamical basis. It's for this reason that it's multiply realizable and in some sense formal. It maintains continuity and identity of the system over time. It puts it back together in the same way each time. It creates a precise, also, self-other distinction. This constraint determines what is self and what is not self. And it converts not self into self in this process. And there, as a result, it's organizing work to create copies of itself, to recreate, to preserve itself, and, of course, to protect self. These are all things that I think are basic to the concept of self, basic to the concept of an organism, and ultimately, I think, basic to the concept of you and I and our personal self. Sorry, I keep doing it the wrong way there. So I want to now move a little bit further and talk about the problem of complexity. Are we talking about something that's more complex? Well, measures of complexity, there's a bunch of different ways people have tried to measure complexity. And I want to suggest that in a sense, we've missed the targets in each case in trying to explain life and self and consciousness and mind and so on. So obviously one of the very first and most basic versions is the kind that comes out of Shannon's theory of information. And here I show two sequences. The top sequence there is one that I've meant to be randomly generated. I don't know whether it's randomly generated. I generated it just sort of by flipping a coin. But here it is. It's a long sequence. And according to the information entropy, this is something that would be hard to compress. That is, you can't come up with an algorithm that produces this if it's truly random. And in that respect, according to this measure, it's a most complex sequence. The second sequence, you'll notice, is actually, in terms of this measure, equally, especially if it's continued on out, equally incompressible by this measure. But interestingly enough, if you look at this, this is just counting. This is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, this one, even though you and I know the algorithm to do this, in terms of statistical or Markovian kind of complexity, it looks as complex as the other one. So there's something that wasn't captured here, and of course, this got recaptured by Kolmogorov and this notion of algorithmic complexity, which measures the compressibility of this. Once you know the algorithm behind this, you can do it quite quickly and simply. You don't have to have the whole sequence. It's deeply compressible. And similarly, a sequence that we often use at random to sort of produce random numbers, which we know is not random in any sense, and yet it looks remarkably random, probably because there's an equal distribution of numbers. The farther out you go, it gets more and more equal in terms of the distribution. And that's, of course, pi. But pi is also compressible if you know the algorithm to produce it. So even though it looks random in some ways, it's a deeply compressible one. Charles Bennett, a father of a lot of sort of modern computing perspectives, has developed a version that's a little more sophisticated. He calls it logical depth, and I kind of like this one a lot. And partly it's because he's looking at the question of what information is and how it's carried. And he says, look, the point is that information is always physical. It always has a physical medium. And in that respect, you're manipulating something physical, whether it's simply charges in a memory store, or it's symbols on a page that you're moving around. There's work that it takes to do this. You can think about this work in terms of number of Turing cycles that might be doing it, or actually the physical work that's done to move these things around. And he says that maybe another measure of complexity that captures it more broadly might be the amount of work it takes to compute something, to generate something. And then finally, Seth Lloyd and Pagels have developed the notion, and there's many more than this, of course, this is just a sampling. This is a little closer to what I'm going to get to. They call it thermodynamic depth. Basically, it's similar to Bennett's notion. They want to know how hard it is to put something together. You know, how much work it takes. Well, it's essentially the same thing about how much work it takes to compute something. But they want to apply it also to physical processes. You know, how much work it took to put it together, how much evolution it took to arrive at something out of it. The amount of information required to specify the trajectory that the system has followed to reach its present state. This is what I'll put there after here. And you can think about that in evolutionary terms. It took a lot of evolution to reach something, or in a Darwinian kind of computing mechanism, how many selection steps it takes to get to a solution. It might be another way to talk about it. So ultimately, all of these have to do with a notion of incompressibility in some ways. That something is more complex if it's harder to compress it. If a description algorithm or design process is compressible, it is predictable on that basis. That is, there's an increase in prediction. And this treats complexity as a measure of unpredictability or of informational entropy in that first sense that I've talked about here. But predictability and compressibility are in this respect linked. By this measure, a random phenomenon is more complex than a highly organized one. That's the troublesome part of this. The more constraint that's exhibited by a structure, the more compressible its description or design algorithm, and therefore the less complex it is. Well, here's the challenge. A living frog, here, because of its highly constrained organization, lots of similar cells, similar toes and fingers, and similar eyes, it's got a lot of redundancy in it. And so as a result of this, it's got a constrained organization, and it's highly compressible. This is how come DNA can generate a frog. I mean, you know, in the appropriate conditions, frog cells, and so on. But now on the right I have here what I call frog soup that's been produced with a randomizer where you drop the frog in. Well, anyway, you get the picture. And I want to ask you, because the one on the right does not have all this redundancy. It's got all kinds of distributional organization. It is, by the measure of compressibility, much more complex than the living frog. That's a real problem. So the question is a living frog less complex than frog soup? And of course not. We know it's more complex. We have an intuition that it's more complex. But the question is, we're going to struggle to find out how that possibly works. The thermodynamic notion of complexity is getting close to it. Because it took a lot of evolution to generate the frog and just a randomizer to generate frog soup. But nevertheless, we haven't quite got to it yet. Here's another intuition that I think might help us with this. This is using things that have meaning. And that's going to be important for what I want to say next. A palindrome, that is something that says the same thing in reverse. So here are these 4 palindromes at the top. I love them all. Basically, if you write them backwards, they say the same thing. Live not on evil reads back and forwards the same way. Never odd or even reads the same way backwards and forwards. I love dogma, I am God, reads backwards and forwards the same way. Drab as a fool, aloof as a bard. Each of these are nice palindromes, some of the most famous palindromes, in fact. There's other ways that you can do this, sometimes called frame shift, in which you just simply take the same sequence and you break it up differently. So on lying old is only in gold. One art hat, no one's escape, is the same as on earth at noon escape. Frame shifts are something that actually occurs in DNA coding a lot. In fact, it can make nonsense out of a DNA sequence by simply knocking out one element in the code. Everything is frame shifted since DNA is encoded in triplets. Knock one out and all the triplets are different all the way down the line. It turns out that in some cases, and bacteria sometimes use this trick, this is one way to generate with the same sequence 2 different protein outputs. You may, by strongly constraining the way you set them up, you can actually get 2 sequences that produce very different proteins, both of which are useful. Very economic way to use your DNA if you have a very limited capacity. And so bacteria sometimes do this kind of thing. Now, what works here, and the reason this has worked, is because what I call they're superimposed but concordant constraints. That is, there are constraints of sequence, constraints of meaning. The constraints of meaning are different than the constraints of sequence. I call this complexity as improbable synergy. There's a synergy here that the meaning and the sequences go together in interesting ways, but notice that the meaning is not something that's physically exhibited. It's not there. This kind of thing is possible precisely because meaning, function, or even value of something is not something that is physically exhibited in the medium that you're looking at. It's something that is outside of that. But of course, functions are something that organisms must have. The function of DNA is not the DNA sequence, it's something else. And for that reason, you can have these kinds of frameshift effects. Systems that are organized around the relationship to something absence, and self is an example of this, have hidden complexity as a result. Each of these has a kind of hidden complexity. If you didn't know English, you wouldn't know that hidden complexity. But in the context of an English interpretation, you can make sense of it. So what I want to say is the example I just gave you about teleodynamic organization produces this kind of effect. Stochastic processes generate increased complexity in the form of increased entropy. We've seen that in the first law, second law of thermodynamics. And nonlinear dynamical processes, those things that are developed to produce morphodynamic and teleodynamic results, generate increased complexity in the form of recursive symmetry breaking, something that, if you're interested in chaos theory, is a big part of the story. And the fractal distribution of form, which is so characteristic of living organisms, is a result of this kind of nonlinearity as well. Teleodynamics, the process that describes these autogenic systems, is a doubly nested, nonlinear, stochastic dynamical relationship. That is, it's doubly nested in which you need morphodynamic processes, which are themselves nonlinearly produced, embedded with each other in a nonlinear relationship between them. All of them are based upon, at the base, thermodynamic processes, which are, in effect, stochastic processes. The result of this is that tiny stochastic variations can become vastly amplified by these processes, fractally redistributed in the system, in such a way that, in effect, each of the variants that are in the system can also be slightly variant from each other because they have a stochastic feature associated with them. It's the kind of theme and variation thing that we see making up organisms all the time. Why the leaves of plants are theme of variation on each other. Why the leaves and the petals of flowers are theme and variation relationships to each other. Why the stamens and the stems are theme and variation relationships to each other. Why the legs of a crawfish are theme and variation relationships to each other. Life uses this all the time. And I like to refer to this as a kind of complexity of regularities. But notice that these regularities are about function. They're forms that have this feature associated with a function, something that they are not officially themselves. Physically, they are linked to this something absence. So I'm going to introduce another measure of complexity that I call dynamical depth to handle this kind of thing. Dynamical depth is defined in terms of the number of levels of nonlinear stochastic processes that are nested with other nonlinear stochastic processes. So in the simple model I just described, there's sort of two levels of this. You have one stochastic process that produces morphodynamic or self-organizing kind of regularity, and another stochastic process above that that links them together. That's a nested version of this process, and it's what produces these kinds of self-like processes, these self-like relationships. The dynamical depth is not correlated with the numbers of distinguishable elements and their independent relationships, nor the compressibility of their generative algorithms, nor the numbers of operations or physical processes required to generate them. So it's not equivalent to any of those other measures of complexity I just talked about. And it's orthogonal to almost all of these algorithmic or structural conceptions of complexity. That is, it's another dimension. It's not one dimension, and not some variant of those. It's another dimension developed for very different reasons, and one of the reasons it looks so different. So what I want to claim here is that the dynamical depth of teleodynamic processes is always greater than the dynamical depth of morphodynamic processes, and is greater than the dynamical depth of thermodynamic processes. And thermodynamic processes have a greater depth than simple mechanistic processes, clockworks, so to speak. How about the dynamical depth of self? Well, teleodynamic organization provides what I would call the minimal level of dynamical depth for defining a function, a reference, a value, and the locus of self that these all depend on. In other words, function, that is, one would say that each of the component dynamics in one of these autogenic systems functions to support the whole, functions to produce the boundary conditions for the other, and they each function to maintain the whole, in some sense. Function is what emerges from this because there's an end, there's a telos, a tendency to maintain the same relationship. That tendency is not in any of the parts, and it's not exactly in the combination. It's in this higher order constraint that holds them all together. So teleodynamic self is constituted when a system is organized with respect to what it's not. That is, its Umwelt, the world outside of it that's relevant to it, its potential substrates and troublesome things in the world, and with respect to which it needs to persist, and with respect to ways that it could become dissociated or destroyed. In other words, its dynamics is organized around not allowing self to dissipate. Thus, not unlike a meaningful phrase or equation, the palindrome, frame shift, and so on, the dynamical depth of self renders it incomplete in some intrinsic way, and defined by its relationships to that which it's not. In other words, it's like a meaning in that sense. So the complexity of self can't be fully assessed in terms of its physical or logical properties alone. Again, you need another kind of measure, and which I'm calling here dynamical depth. So let me just give a couple of comparisons to end here, to think about how to think about the relationship between logical depth, using that as a stand-in for all of these other variants. I think that Ben's version is probably the best of all of them so far, and its relationship to dynamical depth, and some examples. Clockwork. Clockwork has very low logical depth. There's not a lot of parts in relationship to one another to make a simple clock. And it has no dynamical depth. In other words, there's no stochastic feature there. There's no nonlinearity there. And as a result, it has low logical depth, no dynamical depth. That's our classic model of mechanism. Well, mechanisms are a little bit more complicated than that. Think of a supercomputer. A supercomputer has very high logical depth. That is, there's a lot of parts and lots of relationships to each other with complicated dynamics. But it still has no dynamical depth. What we've done is kept the stochastics from being a problem. You've got to cool the system so that heat doesn't become a problem. You've got to do a whole variety of things to make it work still like clockwork, even though it's got this vast complexity in logical depth. On the other hand, think of dynamical systems that are driven by thermodynamics. So, a near equilibrium dissipative process. A snow crystal in almost complete formation, for example, or simply an ideal gas model. There's very high logical depth, lots of parts in interaction here. But the dynamical depth isn't too big in these kinds of systems. Why? Because there's sort of only one level of interaction, and it's not very nonlinear. But a snow crystal, as it's forming, has not much logical depth. There's not a lot of complexity there in terms of the parts. Quite a bit if we want to talk about the number of individual atoms interacting. But its dynamical depth is a little higher than, say, an ideal gas. Why? Because there's not a lot of nonlinearity there. There's a lot of accumulation of constraint, which is what produces its regularity. Now, autogenesis, the simple model I showed a few minutes ago, has fairly low logical depth. There's not a lot of features to it. Not a lot of interactions, and not a lot of things in relation to one another. But it has a fairly high dynamical depth. And this is giving you a sense that these are orthogonal measures. It has a high dynamical depth because it has two layers of embedded stochastic nonlinear dynamical processes to it. Multi-celled organisms with lots more parts have a high logical depth and a fairly high dynamical depth because of this. The human mind has an extreme amount of logical depth because it's generating signals at the millisecond level across billions and billions of components, And it also has extreme dynamical depth, and especially when I put it in the context of a culture in which lots of other people are generating the ideas, the symbols, the thoughts, the history that go into constraining my own thinking. That's an inordinate amount of dynamical depth. Many, many levels of nonlinearity, many levels of stochastic-like inputs. So compare now supercomputer and human mind. The human mind, extreme logical depth, very high logical depth in the supercomputer. I can imagine a supercomputer being designed with the same level of logical depth as a human mind. The point I want to make here is they differ extremely in terms of their dynamical depth. And I think that's going to be a big difference between any kind of computing device and a biological computing device, so to speak. So here's just a sort of a plot to give you a sense of where these guys all fall. I just sort of fudge it that this is not real measures of anything, but I'm imagining a kind of a log measure of logical depth and a log measure of dynamical depth. And you can see clockwork is at the lowest end of the bottom left, and human mind's at the highest end of the bottom, at the top right. Interestingly, notice that a supercomputer, because it's got low dynamical depth, is at the bottom, even though it's at the far right. And this is what I was getting at before. So the question we're going to have to sort of deal with in this process is figuring out if we can go from this notion of computing, which is the notion that we inherited from Turing and von Neumann and so on, and all of the rest, and most of what we work on, in which we create, link a physical machine and figure out how it would link what we will call a virtual machine, a set of relations or algorithms and so on. So computation involves finding or constructing a mechanistic isomorphism with some formal operation or other kind of regular operation, such as I depict over here on the right. But lacking dynamical depth, there is no self. No intrinsic process working against the incessant thermodynamic tendency for that process itself to degrade. In fact, for this to work out, it seems to me, that what needs to happen is our computing system needs to be based upon the thermodynamics, the very thing that we try to eliminate in our computational processes by cooling them off. In some ways, is the very kind of thing that living organisms are driven by. And so in one sense, we've been missing the boat by inverting the story. But there's no reason that it couldn't be implemented in some kind of design artifact. There's nothing in principle that stops this relationship. So let me conclude. My hypothesis is that for a machine to be alive, to have a self, it must be teleodynamically organized. And this is entirely possible. Thanks.